This series is brought to you by you. Thank you so much for all of my patrons and the people who have used the Jackson's affiliate links. It is thanks to you guys that this series have been made possible. Thank you so much. Welcome back to the Colossal Color Showdown. This is episode 2 and we're going to be carrying on looking at Ultramarine Violet from the first episode. And first up we have the Gradated Wash. With the Gradated Wash, what I do is I take a mass tone of paint onto the paper, rinse the brush a little bit, and then go back in with the brush, rinse the brush a little bit again, and then go back in on the paper. And what you're looking for depends on the effect you're looking for. Something like the MaimeriBlue's one or the Da Vinci's one where you get a nice smooth gradation. That means you're gonna get some really nice like sunset and gradated image that are very smooth, and it's gonna not cause you problems. However, if you want a finer control of exactly of the value that you get from your gradated wash, then Sennelier and Szmal might be a better option. And I say that because you get very clear segmentation of color. That means you're going to have a bit more control, whereas the Da Vinci one, MaimeriBlue ones, it just, the paint likes to travel through the water a little bit on their own, a bit more than the Sennelier or the Szmal one. I would say there are a couple ones to avoid if you're doing, well actually there's 3 that I would avoid if you're doing gradated washes. One is the Mission Gold's one, because it will cauliflower on you, and that's not surprised because it has the Phthalo Blue green shade and the Quinacridone magenta. The Phthalos and the Quins, they tend to be more prone to cauliflowering. So if you are not 100% confident with your ability to control the amount of water that's on your brush, then maybe avoid the colors that have cauliflowering. So I would say Mission Gold and MaimeriBlue. MaimeriBlue's one is a little bit more subtle, but there's definitely cauliflowering, so maybe avoid that. Daniel Smith, not quite sure what happened to the mass tone, but it did create this mottled look, which we didn't get in the mass tone. So not quite sure what happened there, but do just watch out for that. So in terms of the red violets, I would, if you want a smooth gradation, definitely go for the Da Vinci. The Da Vinci one is beautifully gradated. That is very smooth. Winsor Newton is pretty good as well. And then for the blue violets, either the MaimeriBlue or the Schmincke, they're about the same. If I had to be nitpicky, then probably MaimeriBlue is slightly better than Schmincke. So yeah, I recommend Da Vinci or the MaimeriBlue if I had to just narrow down to one from the each hues. Then on to the salt reaction. And with the salt reaction, what I do is I put on some paint, and then while the paint is still wet, I sprinkle some just normal table salt, let the paint dry thoroughly overnight, and then I come in with a little palette knife and scrape off all the salt. And then we get to see if the paint has reacted to the salt or not. Now, I assume that if you're using salt, then you're wanting the salt reaction. So that's how I'm going to review the paints in this series. And by far the most reactive is the Schmincke's one. Schmincke's one acts really awesome. You get all this veined, snowflakey look that you expect from putting salt down. Szmal one actually reacts very well as well. And interestingly and very beautifully, this one, you actually get a two-tone effect. So some areas more violet and other areas are pink. And that's incredibly interesting. And it adds more variations and texture and contrast in your painting. Even though you're only using one color, it looks like you've added lots of details in pink. So that's a really good way of enriching your painting without having to do any extra work. Other brands react, I would say, medium amount as well. The one brand that really did not react at all was QoR's one. With the QoR's one, you see exactly where the salt grains landed, but there's none of these vein snowflake look to it whatsoever. So if you are after the salt look, then definitely avoid QoR, because you will just be very disappointed. The Winsor Newton one, when you take a closer look at it, I can see that it's actually reacted quite well. The only thing is it's not such a contrasted looks as the Schmincke's one or the Roman Szmal's one. You can see a high contrast in the values in the different areas, and that makes the pattern stand up more, whereas this is a much softer, much more gentle look to the salt effect. So yes, Winsor & Newton does react quite well, but it's a much more even reaction. I do love how the Schmincke have reacted. Really nice. And finally, we get to look at how the paints mix with other colors. And in the Colossal Color Showdown, I always pick the complementary color to the color we're looking at. And then we also mix it with a yellow, magenta and cyan. In this case, this is cadmium yellow light from Holbein, quinacridone rose from Daniel Smith, and the sailor blue yellow shade by Holbein, just so that you can get a reference on the kind of color I'm mixing with. For the ultramarine violet, certainly for the red violet, the complementary color is actually the yellow green color, and you get some very beautiful muted colors, especially with the Da Vinci. I love this very muted color that has this warmth as well as this. It's just done so nicely. You get areas of greenness, but also some purpleness, and it's a muted color, but a muted neutralized color with a lot of texture thanks to the granulation that's coming through from the ultramarine violet. And you get that two-tone look, especially on where you've lifted the brush off the paper. You know, when you lift the brush off the paper, that area has more paint normally than the other areas, and you definitely get more of the two-tone look on that area. So if you want the neutralized but more two-tone look, then use more water, and that just creates a much more contrasted look to it. Now, the only exceptions to the yellow-green actually being able to mute out the ultramarine violets are the two blue violets. If you remember, we have the Sennelier and the M. Graham that are blue-violet. And those actually get neutralized by the yellow. And this is why when I talk about designing color palettes around the color wheel and making your life a lot easier in terms of neutralizing all the colors on your palette, that I am very picky about which brand you should use. Most people have this normal mid-tone yellow on their palette, and to neutralize those, you can't use the red violets. If you use the red violets, you get all these kind of nice yellow ochre color, but you don't get to mute out the yellow. Whereas if you use the blue violets, then you actually get to mute out the yellow very, very nicely. And that's why I always mention that you should stick to specific brands in terms of picking your ultramarine violet in your color palette. And it's also why the ultramarine violet is incredibly useful, certainly on my palette, is because it allows me to neutralize and mute down a lot of yellows that I have on my palette. And in fact, I very rarely use ultramarine violet on its own. I mostly use it just to mute out the yellow rather than paint ultramarine violet on its own. And the reason why I don't use ultramarine violet on its own in my painting certainly is because I have a lot of very strong high tinting strength colors like the quinacridones and the phthalos, and if I just drop ultramarine violet into that mix, then it's kind of look a bit weak and washed out. And that is the downside of ultramarine violet, is its very weak tinting strength. And by that, what I mean is to say you want to neutralize a color and you have a little dot of green, you're going to need a lot more of your ultramarine violet to mute it out. And that's the same for mixing ultramarine violets with any of the phthalos and the quinacridones. It's just going to lose out on those really strong colors, and you're going to need a ton of ultramarine violets on your palette. And I think that is the reason why some people don't have ultramarine violets on their palette, and they go for something like Colossal Violet or Dioxazine Violet rather than the Ultramarine Violet. I just tend to find the Colossals and the Dioxazine Violets a little bit too red to mute out my yellows, and that's why I have personally a blue violet ultramarine violet on my palette separately to it. So that is it for ultramarine violet. What do I think? Well, it's no secret that I'm a big fan of Schmincke's Ultramarine Violet because it's so useful on my palette. However, I had to put my hand up and say that I never really tested all the other Ultramarine Violets on the market before. So I'm really glad we got to test it out and to really see the difference in each brand. In summary, I think if it's a blue violet that you want to go for, then the choice is just basically whether you want an easy to re-wet color or not. I have to say Schmincke's is decent in terms of how easy it is to re-wet. It's not as easy as the ones that have honey, like MaimeriBlue, Sennelier and Old Holland. However, it's no skin off your nose like the QoR and the Winsor Newton and the Daniel Smiths. Those ones are very, very difficult to re-wet. I really don't see any advantages to the Winsor Newton and the QoR one. We've had a lot of problems with them. They're not the most ideal. The only time I would recommend choosing Winsor Newton is if you're looking for a red violet that granulates heavily. Then it does a beautiful job. It also did a very beautiful soft reaction to the salt test. So if you're looking for that, then go for that. But otherwise, don't bother with Winsor Newton. I would say that the QoR isn't worth its money at all, considering it's the most expensive one and it doesn't do much impressive things and it doesn't really behave the way that I certainly would expect an ultramarine violet to do. The cheapest one we had, of course, was the Mission Gold one. However, I have a personal problem with it because I don't think you should mix really strong Phthalos and quinacodones with the ultramarine violet and still call it ultramarine violet. It makes the paint behave in a way that isn't really what you expect from a natural granulating pigment like ultramarine violet. Oh, I almost forgot. The other major difference between MaimeriBlue and Schmincke is that Schmincke's one is much more granulating. So if you want a heavily granulating blue violet, go for this one. If you don't like the granulation, go for the MaimeriBlue one. And in terms of granulation, if you want a granulating red violet, I would recommend Da Vinci's one over Winsor Newton, just in general, in that unless you're very specifically looking for a heavily granulating ultramarine violet, then go for the Da Vinci one because that still granulates, but it just behaves a little bit better and it gradates beautifully. Let's have a look at that gradation again. Really nice soft gradation that you get from the Da Vinci one, and it looks beautiful. I would say that the Da Vinci one is kind of like halfway between the other red violets and the blue violets. It's a little bit stronger, a little bit cooler, just tiny bit bluer than the other red violets. The MaimeriBlue, I have to say, I was quite disappointed, but I'm also sure that part of the problem is the fact that I had a half band rather than a tube one because the half band created all the bubbles. And I'm sure that if you use the tubed version, then you wouldn't have the bubbling effect. In fact, actually, if you do have the Ultramarine Violet by MaimeriBlue, please let me know if you have the bubbling problem that I'd had. But the gradation itself is so unique and so beautiful that if you're a pigment nerd like me and want to collect very unique pigments that doesn't behave in a way that you expect, certainly compared to other brands, then definitely give the MaimeriBlue a go and see how it granulates on the paper you use. Because this patterning, the really interesting patterning, may be just to do with this particular paper. I might do some further tests on this and try it out on different papers and see how it goes. But for now, definitely very interesting reactions. So, how do I personally feel? Well, I think I'm going to stick to my Schmincke. I know it's very disappointing. I'm sorry. purely because I find it incredibly useful to have on my palette in terms of neutralizing my yellows, and I can't see myself going away from that. But I also have a lot of violets in my palette already, the red violety colors. Like I have Colossal Violet and Colossal Violet and Dioxazine Violet. So I don't feel like that I need to put another violet in, like any of the red violets in. If I were to do it though, I personally would pick the Da Vinci's one because it's nice, much stronger color than the rest, which I need on my palette because I have very strong colors on my palette. I am completely biased. I try to be as objective as I can when I come to describing what I see in front of me in terms of all the tests. But if you're asking what my favorite one is, then it's definitely the Schmincke. I'm definitely interested in doing some more tests with this MaimeriBlue though, because I'm a pigment nerd. That kind of things excites me, and see if this patterning is true on other papers. But yes, for now I am just sticking to keeping my Schmincke's Ultramarine Violet on my palette. What were your favorites from this test? Was there like a color that you started off with that were your favorite and then you changed your mind by looking at this test? Are you inspired to try out a new brand now that you've seen how they behave? Do let me know in the comments down below. If you do get inspired to buy some paints, then please do use the link down below. I've listed where you can get all the paints in the description, and that just helps with me getting some fees back from Jackson's that will go straight towards creating other videos, but it doesn't cost you anything extra. So it's like a free way to support me directly creating these videos. Also, quick reminder, this month's dot card is the companion dot card to this episode. So it's the Ultramarine Violet. You get 8 colors. If you want to try out lots of different colors or lots of different brands, but you don't want to pay for the full cost of buying whole tubes, then this is a great way to try out loads of different brands in a very, very economical way. And so if you want to purchase one of these, then all you have to do is sign up over on patreon.com/Oto Kano and pledge to the appropriate tiers, because there are a few tiers that have the dot card included as your physical reward as a thank you for supporting this channel. It's through the sales of these dot cards and you guys using the affiliate links that actually directly fund the creation of this series. So thank you so much to people who have already signed up or used those things. I really, really appreciate your support, and I hope to see some new faces over on Patreon for these dot cards. So that's it for this episode. And next episode, we're going to be trying a new color. It's going to be cerulean blue. Fascinated to see how the cerulean blue differs across the different brands. And until then, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will speak to you in the next video. Bye!